In the basement archives of the Nebraska State Historical Society, researcher David Chen held a school photograph that would unravel one of the most disturbing mysteries of the American frontier. The faded image showed a young woman standing beside a chalkboard in what appeared to be a one-room schoolhouse. Dated 1874, she was perhaps 25 years old, with neatly arranged hair and the modest dress of a frontier schoolteacher. At first glance, Miss Catherine looked like any other dedicated educator of her era. Her gentle smile suggested kindness and patience, qualities essential for teaching children in the harsh Nebraska territory. But as David adjusted his magnifying glass to study the photograph more carefully, something unsettling caught his attention. Her eyes. While her mouth curved in a soft, reassuring smile, her eyes told a completely different story. There was a hollow, distant quality to her gaze, the look of someone who had witnessed something terrible, something that had fundamentally changed her. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested sleepless nights, and there was a tension in her posture that contradicted her pleasant expression. More disturbing still was what appeared to be scratches on the wooden walls behind her, marks that looked almost like tally marks, carved into the schoolhouse boards. The longer David stared at the image, the more convinced he became that this wasn't just a photograph of a frontier teacher. This was evidence of something far more sinister. His hands trembling slightly, David began to wonder what had happened in that remote Nebraska schoolhouse. What had this young teacher witnessed that had left such terror in her eyes? Little did he know that this single photograph would lead him to uncover one of the most chilling untold stories of frontier education, a tale of isolation, madness, and unspeakable acts hidden in the American wilderness. David couldn't shake the image of those haunted eyes. The next morning, he began researching the origins of the photograph, which had been donated to the Historical Society with a collection of papers from Clearwater County. The location was identified as the Willow Creek School, established in 1872 in one of Nebraska's most remote settlements. School records from the period were sparse, but David managed to locate the district's enrollment ledgers. What he found immediately alarmed him. The Willow Creek School had opened with 37 students in 1872. By 1874, when the photograph was taken, enrollment had dropped to just 12 children. By 1875, the school had closed permanently. David reached out to Dr. Margaret Foster, a specialist in frontier education at the University of Nebraska. When he showed her the enrollment patterns, her expression grew troubled. This kind of dramatic population decline wasn't normal for frontier schools, Dr. Foster explained. Even with families moving west or children aging out, you wouldn't see numbers drop this severely in such a short time. Something catastrophic must have happened to that community. David drove to the site where Willow Creek had once stood. The settlement had long since been abandoned, but the foundation stones of the schoolhouse were still visible among the prairie grass. Local rancher Tom Bradley, whose family had owned the land for generations, agreed to share what he knew. "My great-grandfather used to tell stories about this place," Tom said, leading David to the ruins. "Said there was something wrong with the last teacher they had, a young woman who'd come from back east. Folks started keeping their children home and families began moving away. By winter of 1874, there wasn't anyone left." As they stood among the foundation stones, Tom pointed to deep scratches carved into one of the remaining wooden support beams. "Always wondered about these marks. Look almost like someone was keeping count of something." Back in Lincoln, David began piecing together Catherine's background. Her full name was Catherine Morrison, a 24-year-old woman from Ohio who had arrived in Nebraska territory in the spring of 1872 with impeccable credentials and glowing recommendations from her previous teaching positions. But when David investigated those references more deeply, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Catherine had taught at 3 different schools in Ohio between 1869 and 1872. At each location, similar problems had occurred. Students becoming withdrawn and fearful, families gradually pulling their children from school, and ultimately the schools closing due to declining enrollment. Dr. Foster helped David access teacher evaluation reports from the era. One supervisor in Ohio had written, "Miss Morrison demonstrates adequate knowledge of curriculum, but students seem unusually subdued in her presence. Several children have been observed with unexplained bruises and marks. When questioned, they claim to have fallen or injured themselves at home." Another report was more explicit. Concerned about Miss Morrison's methods of discipline, Students appeared genuinely frightened of her. Recommend close supervision of her classroom activities. David's investigation revealed that Catherine had never been formally disciplined or dismissed from any position. Instead, she had a pattern of resigning just before investigations could be completed, always moving to more remote locations where background checks were less thorough and communities were desperate for any qualified teacher. The Nebraska Territory in 1872 had been the perfect destination for someone seeking to escape scrutiny. Remote settlements were so grateful to have an educated teacher that they rarely questioned credentials or past employment. Catherine had found the ideal hunting ground, isolated children with no way to escape, and parents who saw her as their community's salvation. The photograph from 1874 now took on a sinister new meaning. Catherine's smile hadn't been one of kindness. It had been the expression of a predator who had found the perfect situation to continue her abuse. Undetected, David's breakthrough came when he discovered a collection of letters in the Nebraska Historical Society archives, correspondence between parents in the Willow Creek community during 1873 and 1874. The letters painted a horrifying picture of what had been happening in Catherine's classroom. Mary Patterson had written to her sister in Iowa. Little Johnny has changed so much since starting school. He wakes up screaming from nightmares and begs not to go to Miss Morrison's class. When I ask him what's wrong, he just says the teacher makes them practice being quiet for hours at a time. I don't understand what that means, but it frightens him terribly. Another letter from Samuel Cooper to his brother in Kansas was more explicit. Something's not right with our school teacher. The children come home with marks on their arms and backs, claiming they fell or bumped into things. But my daughter Sarah slipped yesterday and told me that Miss Morrison uses a special stick to help them remember their lessons. I'm thinking of keeping the children home. The most disturbing testimony came from a letter written by Elizabeth Taylor in late 1873. Miss Morrison has introduced what she calls correction sessions for children who misbehave. She keeps them after school in the basement area beneath the schoolhouse. My son William was kept for 3 hours last week and came home shaking and refusing to speak about what happened. The other children seemed terrified of these sessions. David realized that Catherine had been systematically abusing the children in her care, using her position of authority and the isolation of the frontier to hide her crimes. The marks on the schoolhouse wall weren't random scratches. They were her way of keeping track of her discipline sessions, a grotesque record of the terror she had inflicted. The enrollment decline now made perfect sense. Parents had gradually realized something was wrong and had begun removing their children from school. Those who couldn't leave the area had homeschooled their children or sent them to relatives in other towns. David discovered that Catherine's reign of terror had reached its climax during the brutal winter of 1874-1875, with most families having already fled Willow Creek. Only 5 children remained in her classroom, those whose families were too poor to leave or had nowhere else to go. A journal entry from town merchant Jonas Fisher, dated January 1875, provided chilling details. The schoolhouse has become a place of dread. The few remaining children walk there each morning like prisoners going to execution. Miss Morrison has grown increasingly strange, talking to herself and laughing at inappropriate times. The children are pale and silent, jumping at shadows. Dr. Foster helped David analyze the psychological profile that emerged from the historical records. Catherine shows classic signs of someone with sadistic personality disorder, she explained. The isolation of frontier teaching gave her complete control over vulnerable children, and she escalated her abuse as she realized no one could stop her. The turning point came in February 1875. A blizzard had trapped the community for several days, and when it finally cleared, concerned parents went to check on the school. What they found in the basement of the schoolhouse was never officially recorded, but the immediate aftermath spoke volumes. According to Fisher's journal, the school has been closed permanently. The remaining families are packing their belongings and leaving Willow Creek, even in the dead of winter. No one will speak about what they discovered, but I've never seen grown men look so shaken. Whatever happened in that basement, it was evil beyond description. Catherine Morrison had vanished during the blizzard. Her belongings were found scattered in her quarters, and tracks led away from the schoolhouse into the prairie, where they disappeared in the snow. Some believed she had fled. Others suspected she had died in the storm. But the children she had left behind carried scars that would never heal. David's investigation revealed that the authorities had made a deliberate effort to cover up what had happened at Willow Creek School. Official records listed the school's closure as due to declining enrollment and economic factors, with no mention of Catherine Morrison's crimes or disappearance. The territorial government had been eager to promote Nebraska as a safe destination for families, and reports of child abuse by a trusted teacher would have damaged their efforts to attract settlers. Local officials had been instructed to keep the details private, and the traumatized families who fled Willow Creek had been too ashamed and frightened to speak publicly about what had occurred. Dr. Sarah Coleman, a specialist in historical trauma at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, helped David understand the psychological impact on the survivors. In the 1870s, there was no concept of childhood PTSD or understanding of how to help traumatized children, she explained. These children would have carried their trauma in silence for the rest of their lives. David tracked down descendants of the Willow Creek families and found that several had preserved family stories about the terrible teacher and the winter everything changed. Mary Patterson's great-granddaughter, Ruth Miller, still had letters describing her ancestor's son, Johnny, who never fully recovered from his experiences at the school. Johnny grew up to be a troubled man, Ruth explained. He had nightmares his entire life and could never bear to be in closed spaces. The family always said something happened to him in school, but no one ever explained exactly what. The photograph from 1874 had captured Catherine at the height of her abuse, when she had complete control over her victims and believed she would never be caught. Her soft smile and haunted eyes told the story of someone who had found the perfect situation to indulge her sadistic impulses. Isolated children who couldn't escape, parents who trusted her completely, and a community desperate enough for education that they overlooked warning signs. Determined to discover Catherine Morrison's ultimate fate, David expanded his research across the Western Territories. If she had survived the blizzard at Willow Creek, where would she have gone? The pattern of her past suggested she would seek another remote teaching position where her background couldn't be easily verified. His persistence paid off when he found records from a school in Wyoming Territory. A teacher named Catherine Matthews had been hired at the Pine Ridge School in the spring of 1875, just months after Catherine Morrison's disappearance from Nebraska. The handwriting samples and physical description matched perfectly. The Pine Ridge records told a familiar story. The school had opened with enthusiasm and good enrollment, but within a year, the same patterns had emerged: frightened children, concerned parents, and gradually declining attendance. By 1876, the Pine Ridge School had closed and Catherine Matthews had vanished. David traced Catherine's movements across 3 more territories over the next decade. She had worked under at least 6 different names, always targeting the most isolated communities where desperate parents wouldn't ask too many questions about their children's new teacher. Each position had ended the same way: traumatized children, fleeing families, and Catherine disappearing before she could be held accountable. The most disturbing discovery was a letter Catherine had written to a teaching agency in 1879, which David found in their archived correspondence. In it, she had described her philosophy of education. Children must learn absolute obedience and respect for authority. Too many modern parents coddle their offspring. I believe in traditional discipline methods that build character through adversity. Reading between the lines, David realized that Catherine had actually convinced herself that her abuse was educational. She saw herself as a dedicated teacher, improving weak children through harsh discipline, never acknowledging the psychological damage she was inflicting. Her trail finally went cold in Colorado Territory in 1881. Catherine would have been 34 years old by then, with nearly a decade of unchecked abuse behind her. Whether she had died, retired, or simply become more careful about covering her tracks remained a mystery. David's research had uncovered at least 7 schools where Catherine had taught between 1869 and 1881, affecting potentially hundreds of children across 5 states and territories. The true scope of her crimes would never be fully known, as many records had been lost and survivors had taken their trauma to their graves. Working with genealogical databases, David attempted to trace the descendants of Catherine's known victims. What he found was heartbreaking: families with multi-generational patterns of mental health issues, substance abuse, and relationship problems that could often be traced back to ancestors who had attended schools where Catherine taught. Dr. Coleman helped David understand the long-term effects. Childhood trauma, especially sustained abuse from a trusted authority figure, creates lifelong psychological damage. These children would have grown up with trust issues, anxiety disorders, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. The effects would ripple through their families for generations. One of the most poignant discoveries was a diary kept by Emma Fletcher, who had been one of Catherine's students at Willow Creek. Emma had written as an adult, "I have never spoken of what happened in that schoolhouse basement, but the memories haunt me every day. Miss Morrison taught us that adults could not be trusted, that speaking out would only bring more punishment, and that we deserved the pain she inflicted." It took me 30 years to realize none of that was true. David also found evidence that several of Catherine's former students had struggled with education throughout their lives, dropping out of school at early ages or becoming terrified whenever they entered a classroom. The woman who had claimed to be an educator had actually destroyed her students' ability to learn and grow. The photograph from 1874 now seemed even more sinister. Catherine's smile wasn't just hiding her crimes, it was celebrating them. She had posed proudly in front of the classroom where she had systematically traumatized children, confident that her position of authority would protect her from consequences. The scratches on the schoolhouse wall had indeed been a tally system, not just counting abuse sessions, but marking her victims like a serial predator keeping score of her conquests. David realized that his research had uncovered not just one woman's crimes, but a systemic failure that had allowed Catherine Morrison to abuse children for over a decade. The isolation of frontier communities, the desperation for educated teachers, and the lack of communication between territories had created the perfect conditions for a predator to operate undetected. He published his findings in the Journal of American Educational History. Titled "The Hidden Predator: Child Abuse in Frontier Education," the article sparked immediate controversy and soul-searching within academic circles about how the romanticized vision of frontier education had obscured its darker realities. David's research forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, said Dr. Foster. We've idealized the one-room schoolhouse and the dedicated frontier teacher, but we've ignored the fact that isolation and lack of oversight also created opportunities for abuse. Catherine Morrison wasn't an anomaly. She was a predictable result of a system with no safeguards. The story gained national attention when it was featured in American History magazine. Suddenly, families across the country began examining their own genealogical records, looking for ancestors who might have encountered Catherine Morrison or teachers like her. Several readers contacted David with family stories about mysterious trauma and damaged ancestors who had attended remote frontier schools. The Nebraska Historical Society created a permanent exhibit about the Willow Creek School, honoring the memory of Catherine's victims and acknowledging the failure to protect them. The display included the 1874 photograph, now properly contextualized as evidence of one of America's earliest documented cases of systematic child abuse in education. Most importantly, David's research led to new protocols for examining historical educational records, with trained psychologists helping to identify patterns of abuse that had been previously overlooked or dismissed. The silence that had protected Catherine Morrison for over a century was finally broken. Standing in the Nebraska prairie where Willow Creek School had once operated, David reflected on the profound impact of his discovery. The photograph that had started his investigation, showing a young teacher's soft smile hiding eyes full of terror, had revealed a truth that had been buried for nearly 150 years. Catherine Morrison represented something truly horrifying. A predator who had weaponized society's trust in education and teachers to systematically abuse vulnerable children. Her crimes had been enabled by the very isolation and desperation that defined frontier life, turning what should have been places of learning and safety into chambers of terror. The scratches on the schoolhouse wall, visible in that 1874 photograph, had been more than just tally marks. They were evidence of how Catherine had dehumanized her victims, reducing traumatized children to mere numbers in her personal record of cruelty. Each mark represented not just an act of abuse, but the destruction of a child's trust, innocence, and ability to learn. The long-term impact of Catherine's crimes extended far beyond her direct victims. Families had been torn apart, communities had been destroyed, and the trauma had echoed through generations. Children who should have been learning to read and write had instead learned to fear authority, distrust adults, and suffer in silence. David's research had finally given voice to Catherine's victims and their descendants, acknowledging their suffering and exposing the systems that had failed to protect them. The 1874 photograph now served as a powerful reminder that evil could hide behind the most trusted faces and that society's most vulnerable members, children, deserved protection even in the most remote and desperate circumstances. As David prepared to leave the prairie, he thought about the hollow eyes in that century-old photograph. Catherine Morrison's gaze hadn't just shown her own psychological damage. It had reflected the terror of every child who had sat in her classroom, helpless and afraid. The mystery of her haunted expression had been solved, but the legacy of her crimes would serve as an eternal warning about the darkness that could lurk behind a teacher's gentle smile.